All right, well, welcome back, everyone, to Consciousness as Being. The first session this morning, our speaker is Fedor Benevich from University of Edinburgh, and he is going to be speaking to us remotely, obviously, on Suhrawardī's Panpsychism and its origins. Let's welcome Fedor.
Yep, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. There were some bureaucratic hurdles on my way to the States. So let me share my screen. I hope there is a handout going around somewhere there. Okay, so I hope you can see the screen, and I hope you can see the right one. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Suhrawardī's Panpsychism. And originally my title was Suhrawardī's Panpsychism and its origins, meaning historical origins. I'm not going to talk about historical origins today, even though that is part of my paper that I submitted for the volume, because it's more of interest for specialists. So I'm assuming I'm speaking mostly to non-specialists. So let's just focus on Suhrawardī's Panpsychism as such, what it is and what it means. So let's start with a simple question. Who is Suhrawardī? I guess for many of you, this figure will be completely unknown. Now, let's try to locate Suhrawardī first within the history of Islamic philosophy. I like to divide history of Islamic philosophy into two major periods, before and after Avicenna, who died in 1037. And one could say that before Avicenna, the two main traditions of Islamic philosophy are Falsafa and Kalam. I'm not saying these are the only traditions of Islamic philosophy. I'm not saying it's uncontroversial to suggest that Kalam is philosophy, although I do suggest that. Still, I view the history of Islamic philosophy as a history of two main traditions of Islamic philosophy, Falsafa and Kalam, at least before Avicenna. So what are these two traditions? Falsafa is a tradition that goes back to Greek into Arabic translation movement, and it largely depends on late ancient Greek philosophy. Many people usually say it depends on ancient Greek philosophy. This is not entirely correct. It depends on late ancient Greek philosophy. In any case, after Avicenna, Falsafa just becomes Avicenna. So no one, or very few, read actually late ancient Greek philosophical sources translated into Arabic, or for that matter, Islamic philosophers from the tradition of Falsafa before Avicenna. People mainly read Avicenna when they want to understand what is a Falsafa view on a certain philosophical question. Now, there is also another tradition, Kalam. Kalam is more like a tradition of philosophical theology. That's why I'm saying it's not uncontroversial to say that Kalam is a philosophical tradition. Many people will argue that it's just theology. I'm not entirely in agreement with them. What is important about Kalam is that Kalam is largely independent from late ancient or ancient Greek philosophy. Now, if we focus now on what happened after Avicenna, so if we move our attention from before Avicenna to after Avicenna, the traditional way of viewing that period is a period when the philosophers had to choose. They had to choose whether they are with Falsafa or whether they are with Kalam. And Falsafa, as you remember, is personified by Avicenna at that time. Now, in fact, starting from the 13th century, this is not how the picture looks like. More the choice is between, on the one hand, a philosopher called Suhrawardī, who is our main protagonist today, and another philosopher whose name is Fakhr-ad-Din Razi. And as you can see, they live more or less at the same time, around the end of the second half of the 12th century of the Christian era. So it's not a controversy or like a battle between Avicenna and Kalam anymore. It's a battle between Suhrawardism and Razianism, if you want. So in this picture, Suhrawardī is an updated version of Avicennism, while Fakhr-ad-Din Razi is something like an updated version of Kalam. So it is still, in a way, indeed, a controversy between Avicenna and Kalam, but between these two updated versions of Avicenna and Kalam. So a very simplified way of putting that historical picture and to identify Suhrawardī historically would be to say is that Suhrawardī is what late ancient Greek philosophy has become in the Islamic world through many, many steps, through Greek into Arabic translation movement, through early Arabic philosophy, through Avicenna himself, and then through this clash with Kalam that happened after Avicenna. And the result is basically Suhrawardī. So why I'm saying all this? Because this contradicts the traditional way of how Suhrawardī was understood. If you look up in the literature, in most of it, Suhrawardī will be presented as an opponent of Avicenna's philosophy, and in fact of philosophy in general. And this view was mostly suggested by Henri Corbin, the French philosopher from the 20th century. So he suggested what I call a spiritualist reading of Suhrawardī. According to Corbin and Corbanians, as they are called, Suhrawardī was a mystic or a reviver of some ancient Iranian Zoroastrian gnosis, or sometimes it's called theosophy. This understanding of Suhrawardī is not completely out of blue. It is actually largely based on Suhrawardī's own ways of presenting himself as an opponent of peripatetics. So Suhrawardī repeatedly propagates himself as someone who stands in opposition to Avicennian philosophy and to this peripatetic philosophy in general, as well as the other reason why people think that Suhrawardī was this kind of a mystic or a reviver of some ancient Iranian Zoroastrian gnosis is his own rather cryptic and metaphorical ways of expressing himself. And one of those metaphorical ways of expressing himself is the fundament, the basis of the whole Suhrawardian philosophy, which is sometimes called philosophy of light. So for Suhrawardī, if you just read the text, this is what you will see, that the fundamental principle of everything existing in the world is light, that God is labeled as the light of lights, in Arabic Nur and War, that the material world is under governance of what Suhrawardī calls the lords of lights, or the lords of species sometimes, and most of them are usually identified in Suhrawardī's text as Zoroastrian gods. So this is a possible basis for supposing that Suhrawardī is trying to revive Zoroastrian gnosis. And finally, when you turn to the pages on which Suhrawardī explains his epistemology, he argues that the traditional peripatetic ways of understanding knowledge are all wrong, and that in fact knowledge happens through what he calls illumination, ishraq, of the knower. And another notion that Suhrawardī also uses, and that is very much used in contemporary literature on Suhrawardī, is knowledge by presence, in Huduri. And that is why the whole of Suhrawardian philosophy, and his main book actually that we are going to read today together, is called Philosophy of Illumination. So this all sounds very cryptic to a person who doesn't try to look into details of this. So what happened in recent years is that many scholars, in recent, I mean like 10, 20 years, maybe last 10 mostly, that there was this new trend of how to read Suhrawardī, and it was developed against Corbanianism. And the main aim of this method is to demystify Suhrawardī, to try to make sense to what he says, or to give sense to what he says. And the result of this new reading of Suhrawardī is the following picture, that Suhrawardī in fact largely follows the conceptual framework of Aristotelian Avicennian philosophy, with some emphasis on the emanationist elements of Neoplatonism, and indeed some original elements developed in response to Kalam. So within this new picture of Suhrawardī, Suhrawardī is basically a new version of Avicennism, not anti-Avicennism. And most importantly, of course, Suhrawardī is not a person who argues against philosophy. He's a philosopher himself. He's just suggesting a different kind of philosophy, full with different kinds of philosophical doctrines. So with this background in mind, let us turn to my topic today. So the aim of my paper that I submitted for this conference was to demystify, indeed, not Suhrawardī in general, but the core notion of his philosophy, the notion of light. So I will suggest today that light is just a metaphorical way of saying consciousness. And when I say consciousness, I mean something like an umbrella term that covers all kinds of phenomenal experience, both of ourselves and of other things. So, of course, Suhrawardī does not use the notion of consciousness, and I will not pretend like he does. Indeed, he uses the notion of light instead. So his notions will be such very normal general notions as knowledge, ilm, or perception, idrak. And in both cases, Suhrawardī will mean something like cognitive awareness or phenomenal experience of the certain subject of perception or of an intelligible. So, according to Suhrawardī, the phenomenal experience of ourselves and of other things cannot be explained away through any underlying physical process, nor is this kind of phenomenal experience of ourselves or of other things reducible to the immateriality of the subject. So this is the basis, the systematic basis for his philosophy of light. According to Suhrawardī, in other words, consciousness is a basic, irreducible phenomenon, precisely the one that he calls light, and everything in the world is either some kind of conscious subject or it is ontologically dependent on something that possesses consciousness. So, if you know anything about Avicenna's philosophy, one thing that you probably might have heard is that for Avicenna, God is necessary existent, and that existence kind of emanates from God into the world, leading to the existence of all existing things. So what Suhrawardī does is that he replaces existence with his light, consciousness, and for him, consciousness is the source of all things in the world, which leads Suhrawardī to developing what I call a panpsychist ontological hierarchy, in which God is pure consciousness, the paradigm case of consciousness, and then from God emanate all other kinds of consciousness, or better to say, separate conscious beings, such as Platonic forms that are actually also Platonic intellects, and from there emanate everything else that there is in the world, that is conscious phenomena in the world, conscious beings in the world, such as human, plants. Even plants have consciousness in Suhrawardī, that's true, I didn't misspoke. And finally, also unconscious phenomena. They are also there, and they also emanate from these conscious beings that are Platonic intellects. So this is basically what I'm trying to present today. This is the whole doctrine, and we are going to do it in 4 steps. So the first will be arguments in favor of irreducibility of phenomenal experience to physical processes. So Suhrawardī will argue against the idea that inherence of representational form in the sense organ is necessary and sufficient condition for experience. Then we will move on to arguments that Suhrawardī provides in favor of irreducibility of self-awareness to the immateriality of the subject. So this will be the 2 sets of arguments that Suhrawardī develops against the Aristotelian Avicennian philosophical understanding of consciousness. And from there, we will move on to Suhrawardī's positive doctrine. So in sections 3 and 4, we will talk about how Suhrawardī argues that conscious beings are just pure consciousness or pure light. So there is nothing to them more beyond being just conscious. And finally, we will end up talking about Suhrawardīan hierarchy of lights or of conscious beings, how everything emanates from God, and how everything depends on conscious beings that exists. So that's the plan for today. Let us begin with in the beginning, so with the section 1. Now, that might sound as a scandal for many people who are in the audience, I guess, but Suhrawardī definitely thinks that according to Avicenna, or according to the Aristotelian Avicennian model, sense perception just amounts to the inherence of representational form in the sense organ. So there is nothing beyond that. So the fact that I'm seeing something means that the representation of that thing just inheres in my eye, it is there, so it's a physical process of the inherence of representational form in the sense organ, and that is necessary and sufficient condition for the occurrence of the phenomenal sense perception of vision. So there is nothing beyond that. I know that it is very problematic, especially if you think that this is something that might Aristotle say, or Avicenna. Even for Avicenna it's problematic, but this is definitely how Suhrawardī understands Avicennian theory of perception. So in this picture, phenomenal experience is just underlying physical process. And Suhrawardī clearly rejects this kind of understanding of phenomenal experience. So he says the following: other scientists have argued that vision is the imprinting of the thing's form in the crystalline humor, but this theory involves them in difficulties. Among them is the fact that we see the mountain as being large. If vision is by the form, and if the mountain does have the magnitude that it has, how then can this great magnitude be contained within the tiny pupil? So this argument, of course, is very famous. It is known as incommensurability argument. And I think many people believe that it is an extremely naive and simplistic argument. So basically saying, oh, how can you believe that vision happens by the imprinting of the form of a mountain in the eye, because mountain is so much bigger than the eye. So that sounds like an extremely naive argument, because of course vision happens in more complicated ways, even if you have a very physicalist understanding of this process. But if you think about the nature of this argument, incommensurability argument, actually it's not so naive. So the idea here is that if we just compare on a purely phenomenal, a purely conceptual level, mountain on the one hand and eye on the other hand, so the magnitude properties of the mountain will just not fit in the eye. So you cannot try to explain away the magnitude of the mountain through some kind of reduction that happens within the representational image, because we're talking here on a purely phenomenal level. So there is no, it doesn't matter what actually happens there on a physical level. So this is important. With the very first argument, Suhrawardī immediately draws his attention to this kind of phenomenal level at which we perceive things. And he continues in the same manner with his second argument. This is your T2 on your handouts. He says, know that taste is not identical to something touching the tongue. Even if the former requires the latter, two things do not become one. The definition of sound as the vibration of the air is problematic as well, for the former can be conceived of without the conception of the latter and vice versa. Moreover, one can perceive the vibration with their senses without the perception of the sound. So Suhrawardī argues here that one can conceive of sound without conceiving of the vibration of the air. And that is why sound is not just identical to the vibration of the air. Of course, this is a version of what is known very well in contemporary philosophy under the title knowledge argument. So the phenomenal content of our perception is just different from what we think of when we think of the natural or physical process, and therefore these two things are distinct. I'm not saying knowledge argument is 100% bulletproof. I actually probably believe that it's wrong, but Suhrawardī definitely uses this argument to support his theory. Note here that when Suhrawardī talks about taste, he says, even if the former requires the latter, two things do not become one. So this is also important because Suhrawardī admits that, at least in this passage, that it is still possible that the phenomenal experiential phenomenon depends on the physical process. So one can't happen without the other, so there is certain kind of extensional identity, but they're not metaphysically identical, so there are still two different metaphysical objects. So this approach to phenomenal experience, it can be put in another way by saying that phenomenal experience is not logically supervenient on physical processes. So obviously I'm here using the notions developed by David Chalmers. So the idea being that if X is logically supervenient on Y, then X can be defined for Y. So Suhrawardī rejects it. He says that sound cannot be defined by something else. I'm quoting here T3. For none of the simple sensations can be defined. Such definitions would ultimately have to be reduced to objects of knowledge needing no definitions. Otherwise, there would be infinite regression, but there is not. There is nothing more evident than sensations to which definitions might be reduced, since all our knowledge is abstracted from sensations. Therefore, the simple sensibles are known directly and have no definitions. The reality of sound cannot be defined at all to someone without the sense of hearing, nor can luminosity be defined to someone without a sense of sight. So you will never be able to explain how it feels to hear something or how it feels to see something to a person who cannot see or cannot hear. So Suhrawardī argues that experiential phenomena are indefinable, so you cannot define them for anything at all. They're like actually the most basic items of our knowledge and everything else is defined through them and not the other way around, meaning that they're logically irreducible. So the non-identity of experiential phenomena with physical processes, okay, is granted, but Suhrawardī believes that it in fact leads to a real possibility that experiential phenomena can happen without underlying physical processes. And this is what he says about a very curious case, I think, about Pythagorean music. So he says, the spheres have sounds, so the Pythagorean music was obviously about the music of the spheres. So the spheres have sounds not caused by the same causes as our sounds. We have explained that sound is not identical to vibration of the air. The most that one can say is that sound here is conditioned on it. However, it does not follow that if something is conditioned on a thing in one place, it's like is necessarily so conditioned. Thus, there may be sounds and music in the spheres not conditioned on air or ringing. So we have seen so far that Suhrawardī admitted that sound, even if it is not identical to the physical process underlying the sound, to the vibration of the air, it is still dependent on it. So in our world, like in everyday life, whenever there is sound, there is probably, at least probably, there is something that underlies it on the physical level, and that is the vibration of the air. But the non-identity of sound and the physical process at least gives an opportunity that it could be different. And that is how Pythagorean music works. There is no vibration of the air, obviously, in the spheres, because there is no air there, but there is still music, and that music is different. It is just a phenomenal sound by itself, maybe with some different, coming from some different physical process, but maybe not, maybe just without any material process whatsoever. And this is important because the irreducibility of phenomenal experience to physical processes for Suhrawardī opens the way for what one might be called immaterial perception, even if it sounds like an oxymoron. So for Suhrawardī, we can have perception in the afterlife, that is, after we don't have any bodies anymore. In the case of mystical visions, he also explains in the same way beatific vision, or even God's perception of the material universe, so the other way around. So all this can happen because the phenomenal content of the perception may be the same as for physical sense perception, but there is not any underlying physical processes in any of those cases. So basically the idea would be that God sees the blue sky just in the same way as I do, but there is an underlying physical process that at least happens simultaneously with the experience in the color blue of the blue sky. For God, there is no physical process. God just sees the blue of the blue sky because this is an independent, immaterial, phenomenal experience. Let's move on. So now we need to talk about self-awareness. So the consciousness as being self-aware and having an experience of yourself. So Avicennian position, again, is something quite famous, and there were a little bit of discussion of it yesterday. So the idea would be not of Avicennian position, but of the same idea. So that immateriality automatically leads to self-awareness, and that self-awareness is some kind of a default state of immaterial beings. So if you're immaterial, you're self-aware. That's it. If you want, this is a reductionist model of self-awareness, at least as I understand it, because it does allow that we can explain self-awareness for something else. Well, admittedly, this is a very negative reductionist model. So you explain through the absence of something, through the absence of matter. But I think it is enough to deem this model as a reductionist model because it says that self-awareness is something, so is immateriality. Well, Suhrawardī again rejects this kind of approach to consciousness. So he says, in addition, we argue that were we to posit a flavor abstracted from barriers in matter, we would only have shown that it was a flavor in itself, nothing more. It does not follow that an incorporeal flavor is evident to itself, only that it is a flavor in itself. Were the fact that a thing is free from prime matter and barriers sufficient to make it aware of itself, as is the opinion of peripatetics, then that prime matter whose existence they assert would be also aware of itself, since it is not a state in something else, but has its own essence and is free from any other prime matter, there be no matter of prime matter. So Suhrawardī argues that immateriality in itself does not imply self-awareness, because otherwise just an incorporeal concept of flavor would have self-awareness. So just remove matter, have the flavor as itself, like as a concept, and it will be aware of itself. Well, it doesn't have matter, so immaterial, so aware of itself. Moreover, and this is the second part of the argument, if having no underlying matter implies self-awareness, then in fact prime matter would be self-aware, because obviously there is no prime matter, further prime matter for prime matter, so why not assume that prime matter has self-awareness? For Suhrawardī, self-awareness is irreducible. It means that nothing else can explain self-awareness. So this is something like a datum. He argues as follows. This is your T6. If a thing makes something evident to another, then that other thing ought to be evident to itself, so that something else could be evident to it. Once this is established, we say that there cannot be an entity that makes a thing evident to that same thing in such a way that the thing becomes evident to itself. So 2 points are here important. One is pretty normal. The idea being that in order that something else becomes evident to something, that the thing needs to be self-aware in the first place. But the other idea is crucial for Suhrawardī's understanding of self-awareness. He says that nothing can provide self-awareness. Self-awareness belongs to things in themselves. So you cannot find an explanation why you have self-awareness. You either have it or you don't. And that's his point. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just something happened here. Let's move on. So let's move to Suhrawardī's positive doctrine. That is his theory of light, and my suggestion that light is just consciousness in Suhrawardī. So there are a few passages that explicitly confirm my suggestion, although I admit that, so my suggestion that light is consciousness is a kind of interpretation, really. So it's my attempt to explain what's going on there, but there are things that confirm my interpretation. So, for example, Suhrawardī, when he defines light, he says, light is that which is evident in its own reality, and by essence makes another evident. Or elsewhere he says, light is evident, and its being evident is its being light. So light is something like evidence, or being evident. And I connect this notion of evidence and evidence and being evident to the notion of consciousness. That is mostly because how Suhrawardī discusses and presents the idea of pure light. So things that are purely light and they have nothing else from light. He says that these things are such that they have an essence of which they are not unconscious. Or he also defines them as that which perceives itself and that which is evident to itself. So let's look at it now in more detail. What does it mean that something is a pure light? That it is something like something that is not unconscious of itself, as Suhrawardī says. Here it's your T7, and this is Suhrawardī's argument that things that are pure light, they're just pure consciousness. They have nothing else to them in their essence. So this is a little bit a longer passage. He says, if you examine this matter closely, you will find that that by which you are you is nothing but a thing that apprehends its own self, your I-ness. All else that apprehends its own self and I shares with you in this. Consciousness, that is literally what he says there, being a perceiver, therefore is neither an attribute nor something superadded of whatever sort, nor is it just a part of your I-ness, since the other part would still remain unknown. But there is something beyond consciousness and awareness, it would be unknown and wouldn't belong to yourself, whose awareness is not superadded to it. It is thereby apparent that being something is not superadded to consciousness. So notice this being something means basically essence, any kind of essence, is not superadded to consciousness either, for it is evident in itself to itself. There is no other property with it for which being evident could be a state. It is simply the evident itself, nothing more. There are a few things going on here. Obviously, I cannot go through all of them right now. My point is simple. So Suhrawardī argues here that conscious beings have no essence beyond being conscious. So this is just their essence, and to be conscious or consciousness itself. And another thing that I want to say about this passage is that it is obviously a development of Avicenna's blind man argument. Not sure everyone is familiar with it, but just remind you very quickly, Avicenna argues that we can conceive of ourselves without our bodies or without thinking of our bodies, and therefore our selves or our essences, depending on the interpretation of a blind man argument, are distinct from our bodies. So Suhrawardī develops this thought, so this kind of conceptual test of what belongs to our essence, and he asks, what is there that we cannot conceive ourselves to be free from? So, okay, it's not bodies, but what is there that really must remain? And he says that the only thing of which we cannot be free in our conception of ourselves is just the being self-conceiver. So just the being conscious, being understanding yourself and being aware of yourself. These are the only things of which you, because by thinking, by conceiving of something, you already presuppose that you're a conceiver, if it is a word at all. So, or like a perceiver, if you want. So that's why our essence, the essence of pure light, is just consciousness, is just being a perceiver, and that's it. There is another passage in which Suhrawardī basically says the same. He says, a perceiver cannot perceive himself without the presence of life which can be expressed as being a self-perceiver. Whatever the special thing is distinct from life is not among that which we necessarily find in a perception of our I-ness. Therefore, life is the essence of the soul. So here Suhrawardī introduces a new notion, the notion of life, and he says that basically life is the same as being a self-perceiver, something that I understand to be just consciousness, and this is the essence of our soul. All other ways of understanding soul are wrong, and he argues at length about that it is wrong to define human as a rational animal, because this is not actually the definition of human, because what you remember, we cannot logically explain things that are given to us in our consciousness through any kind of definition. So it must be something that is given to us directly, and the only thing is given to us directly when we think about ourselves is thinking of ourselves, is consciousness. Okay, so now if I can finally move to having laid down these foundations to the whole universal view of things that they are in the world according to Suhrawardī. So he distinguishes between things that are light and things that are dark. So this is where lots of metaphorical language is going to finally pop up. He says, a thing is either light and luminosity in its own reality, or is not light and luminosity in its own reality. Light is divided into light that is a state of something else, that is the accidental light, and light that is not a state of something else, the incorporeal or pure light. That which is not light in its own reality is divided into that which is independent of a locus, that is the dusky substance, so this is something independent of the subject of inherence, and that which is a state of something else, that is a dark state. So if you apply my interpretative tool, saying that light is consciousness, we, from several steps that I unfortunately cannot go through right now, we reach the following classification, so that there are 4 types of entities in the universe. The first type are just light things. So things are pure consciousness, there is nothing else to them. Then there are light states. Light states are the objects of phenomenal experience, so how things taste, how things look. Intelligibles are also probably here. They are also objects of some kind of phenomenal experience, not sense perception, but intellection. So these are all light states. And then on the other hand, there are unconscious beings that Suhrawardī calls dusky substances. So these are just basically bodies, crude bodies. And they have, what Suhrawardī says, dark states. These are corporeal features. He doesn't mention many of them, so this is where it becomes a little bit obscure. At least quantity is this kind of dark state, that's for sure. So the measure of the magnitude of the body. So there are 2 points that we need to take into account when we talk about this hierarchy, this classification of beings. And the first point is that there are many different kinds of light beings. So, for example, God is this kind of pure consciousness. Infinite number of celestial intellects are also pure consciousness. Human souls, animal souls, plants, they're all pure consciousness. So if each of them is simple consciousness, then we can reasonably wonder how are they different from each other. So if we apply the identity of indiscernibles principle here, how is it possible that they're in fact different things? And there was a similar problem in Avicenna, because for Avicenna, God was pure existence. And the question was, how is God different from our existence if God is just pure existence? And as many of you know, the famous solution that became even more famous in the Latin tradition is the theory of analogy of existence, the idea that God's existence is more perfect than ours. What Suhrawardī suggests, and in fact, actually, this is kind of marginal note, but analogy of existence is not proper Avicenna theory, but it's what Suhrawardī develops on behalf of Avicenna. This is a different thing to say. So, but he also develops this theory that I call analogy of consciousness. So he uses the same model, and he says that God's consciousness is just more perfect than ours, and even more perfect than of the celestial intellects. So this is a typical Neoplatonic story that happens from there on. There is a hierarchy in which, ontological hierarchy, in which consciousness becomes weaker and weaker until it reaches what can be called accidental lights. That is an experiential phenomenon, things that are objects of conscious experience of other beings, but they are not conscious themselves. And finally, non-conscious beings and their states, these are the bodies, they also emanate from conscious beings. Which brings me to the second point, that non-conscious stuff ontologically depends on conscious stuff in this kind of picture. There's a proof for it. I don't want to go through it right now because I have no time. I prefer to look at Suhrawardī's proof of Platonic intellects. So how he proves, this is a case study, it's on your T10, I'm not going to read it out. So how Suhrawardī proves that there are these Platonic intellects, so this middle layer, and for Suhrawardī there are infinite number of Platonic intellects. It's not like 10 celestial intellects traditionally there in the Avicennian doctrine. There are like infinite number of them, and they organize everything in the world. So this is the summary of the argument. He says there are actions of nourishment and growth of our bodies, and he argues that these actions must be regulated by a conscious being, as their patterns do not correspond to the pattern of natural motions. So they move in different directions and they kind of move unpredictably, and that's how nourishment and growth works. Still, those actions cannot be something that is regulated by us ourselves, because we are not conscious of those actions. So in order that those actions can be performed by a conscious being, they need to be performed by someone who is aware of them, and we are not aware of them. Obviously, I'm not aware of how my own process of nourishment works. And that is why, according to Suhrawardī, those actions must be regulated by a separate conscious being, those Platonic intellects. And the same kind of approach applies to all kinds of bodies. Suhrawardī will argue that their procreation and preservation as a species, it all depends on the existence of what he calls lords of species, or lords of lights. So these are these Platonic intellects that work as the middle layer in his ontology, and they organize everything in the sublunary sphere, and everything that happens in the sublunary sphere depends on it ontologically. Moreover, Suhrawardī also says that it applies to natural motion. This will be my last quotation for today. So he says that the downward motion of a rock does not occur by its nature alone. Were it in its proper pace, it wouldn't move, but also requires something compelling it. That which compels it must either go back to managing incorporeal light, or to something caused by heat that necessitates it. I must admit there are a couple of things I'm not entirely sure what's going on here in this passage. For example, this conditional clause, were it not in its proper place, it wouldn't move. Not sure what was the force of it. But I think it's pretty clear, whatever is the details of the argument, that Suhrawardī argues that he rejects the main basis of Aristotelian and Avicennian natural philosophy, that there's a distinction between natural and voluntary motion, and he says that even natural motions in the world are regulated by conscious subjects. So the rock falls not because it's the nature of rock to fall, but because there is a Platonic intellect, actually the goddess of earth, I think in this case, that regulates this downwards motion of the rock. So everything depends on conscious beings. So let's conclude. Suhrawardī argues that conscious experience of ourselves and other objects is irreducible, and he calls this kind of conscious experience light. And this conscious experience appears in various forms, so whether it's pure consciousness or just phenomenal experience. It's important to understand about this theory that it is not correct to think of it as that there are things that have consciousness. For Suhrawardī, consciousness is really basic. So there are some things that are pure consciousness while others are not. And that's why for him, God is like pure consciousness. It's not like God has consciousness. God is consciousness. So this brings us back to the idea that these things have no essence beyond consciousness. And finally, I suggest that we can call his theory panpsychist, his whole worldview a panpsychist worldview. I admit that there are also unconscious beings in the world, so it's not like everything in his worldview is conscious. But I think it still counts as panpsychist because everything, as I have shown, depends in its even natural motions depends on the conscious beings. So this is still, in my understanding, falls under panpsychist label. Thank you for your attention. That's it.